My daughter left me standing at curbside departures with 2 suitcases and told me to figure it out myself. Then she got in her car and drove away. No hug, no wave, just taillights disappearing into Phoenix traffic while I stood there in 104-degree heat, holding a garment bag with my son-in-law's blazer still on the hanger, because nobody had bothered to take it back inside. I want you to sit with that image for a second because I did. I stood with it for almost 40 minutes before anything else happened. But that's not where this story ends. Not even close. My name is Walter Sorensen. Everyone who's known me more than 5 minutes calls me Walt. I'm 67 years old. I spent 34 years as a structural engineer at a firm called Bartlett & Cole in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. The kind of job where your name ends up stamped on bridges and parking structures nobody thinks twice about, until the day they don't fall down. I live alone now in a brick ranch house on Marlowe Avenue, 3 blocks off Utica Square, in the same house I raised my daughter in, the same house my wife Margaret died in 3 years ago this past April. I used to believe that if you built something solid enough, it would hold. Beams, buildings, families. I was wrong about at least one of those, and it took an airport parking curb in Arizona to teach me which one. What happened next is something I'll remember for the rest of my life, and not for the reason you'd think. Let me back up. Renee is my only child. 38 years old now, married to a man named Craig Blake for going on 9 years, living in a subdivision outside Scottsdale called Desert Ridge Estates. The kind of place with a guard gate that doesn't actually stop anybody, and a homeowners association that fines you for the wrong shade of beige. Craig runs something called Blake Horizon Development. Boutique residential projects. The kind of business card that says a lot of words and tells you almost nothing. My granddaughter Bailey is 15, a sophomore at Chaparral High School, and she is without question the best thing that family produced. I'll get to why that matters later. Margaret and I raised Renee to be independent. Maybe too independent. By the time she was 22, she'd moved to Arizona for a marketing job and never really moved back. Not even for holidays some years. And Margaret used to say that was fine. That was healthy. Birds are supposed to leave the nest. I went along with it, because arguing with Margaret about our daughter never once ended well for me in 28 years of marriage. After Margaret passed, Renee called more. Every Sunday for the first year. Then every other Sunday. Then it became a text message that said, "Thinking of you, Dad?" with a heart emoji, sent usually around 9 at night, which is when I've come to understand people send messages they don't want to have a conversation about. So when Renee called me on a Tuesday in late August and said, "Dad, I want you to come out for Labor Day weekend. Just us. Bailey's been asking about you." I nearly dropped the phone. I hadn't been invited to Scottsdale in over a year. I booked the flight that same night. Southwest, Tulsa to Phoenix Sky Harbor, Friday afternoon, seat 14C, $287 round trip. And I remember packing my bag thinking this was Margaret's doing somehow, like she'd nudged something loose from wherever she is now. I flew out on a Friday in the last week of August. Renee picked me up at baggage claim wearing sunglasses indoors, which should have told me something right there. And she hugged me the way you hug a coworker at a holiday party. Quick, performative, over before it starts. Bailey wasn't with her. "She's got a thing," Renee said, which turned out to mean absolutely nothing, because Bailey had no thing. Bailey was home the entire weekend, confused about why nobody brought her to the airport. The first 2 days were fine. Strange, but fine. Craig grilled steaks Saturday night and talked for 40 minutes about a development project in Cave Creek he called the crown jewel of the portfolio, a phrase he used at least 3 separate times, like he was rehearsing it for someone who wasn't me. Bailey and I sat on the back patio Sunday evening, and she showed me a robotics project she'd built for a school competition. a little wheeled contraption that could navigate a maze using sensors she'd coded herself. And I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in months, watching her explain torque and gear ratios to her grandfather like she actually wanted me there. I want you to remember that patio conversation, because it matters later. Sunday night, after Bailey went to bed, Renee and Craig sat me down at the kitchen island with a manila folder and 2 glasses of wine I hadn't asked for. Craig did most of the talking. "Walt, we wanted to talk to you about something important while you're here," he said, sliding the folder toward me like a man presenting a quarterly earnings report. "It's about estate planning, protecting the house on Marlowe, making sure everything's clean and simple down the road, no probate headaches, nothing messy." I opened the folder. Inside was a document titled Quitclaim Deed with Retained Life Estate. My address in Tulsa typed across the top, and 2 blank signature lines below mine. One for Renee, one for Craig. "This adds us to the deed," Renee said too quickly, the way people talk when they've rehearsed the next 4 sentences. "You keep living there, nothing changes for you. It just avoids probate court when the time comes. Everybody does this now, Dad, it's smart." I want to be clear about something because people ask me this a lot. I wasn't offended by the concept of estate planning. I'm 67 years old. I know exactly how these conversations are supposed to happen. And I'd already had one, 3 years earlier, with my own attorney, a man named Warren Pike, who has an office on Riverside Drive in Tulsa, and who drew up a perfectly good will after Margaret died. What bothered me was the folder, the urgency, the fact that this document had apparently been sitting ready, notarized blank lines and all, waiting for a weekend when I happened to be a captive audience 2,000 miles from my own lawyer. "I'd like Warren to look this over first," I said. "That's all. Just want him to read it before I sign anything." The temperature in that kitchen dropped about 15 degrees. "Dad, it's a standard form," Renee said. "You don't need a lawyer to review a standard form." "Then it won't take him long," I said. Craig's jaw did something small and tight. "We were kind of hoping to get this squared away before you flew out tomorrow. There's a title window issue on our end, some financing timing. It's complicated, but it really does need to happen soon." Financing timing? I filed that phrase away without knowing yet how important it would become. I didn't sign anything that night. I told them I loved them. I told them I'd have Warren look at it Monday, and I went to the guest room and lay awake until nearly 2 in the morning, listening to the low murmur of an argument happening 2 rooms away that I wasn't meant to hear, but heard anyway. The way houses carry sound when everyone thinks everyone else is asleep. I couldn't make out words, just tone. And tone, after 34 years reading blueprints for load-bearing weaknesses, is a thing I've gotten very good at detecting. I didn't know it yet, but that folder on the kitchen island was about to be the least surprising thing that happened to me that weekend. Monday morning, Renee was different. Cold, in a way that wasn't rude exactly, just efficient, like I'd become an item on a checklist instead of her father. She told me my flight had been moved up 2 hours due to a schedule change on Southwest's end, which I later learned was not true. My flight never changed at all. It left exactly on time, at 3:40, as originally booked. But I didn't know that yet. I just knew she said we needed to leave the house by 11 instead of 1, and I scrambled to repack. And Bailey came downstairs in her school uniform looking confused, saying, "Wait, Grandpa's leaving already? I thought we were doing the robotics thing again." And nobody answered her. The drive to Sky Harbor took 18 minutes. Renee didn't turn on the radio. I asked about Bailey's fall soccer schedule and got one-word answers. When we pulled up to the departures curb at Terminal 4, she put the car in park, popped the trunk from the driver's seat without getting out and said, "Okay, this is you." I got out. I pulled my suitcase from the trunk. I reached back in for the garment bag with Craig's blazer, which had somehow ended up mixed in with my things. I held it up and said, "This one's Craig's, isn't it?" And that's when she said it. Window still down, sunglasses still on, engines still running. "Figure it out, Dad. I've got a lot going on right now." And she pulled away from the curb into 3 lanes of departing traffic, leaving me standing there holding a stranger's blazer and 2 suitcases at 11:20 in the morning, with a flight that didn't leave for 4.5 hours. I stood there for a long moment, the way you stand there after you've been hit by something you didn't see coming, checking yourself for damage before you understand what actually happened. Skycaps moved around me. A family of 5 hauled matching luggage past. Somewhere a car horn went off twice, short and irritated. I called Renee's cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I texted her, "You forgot Craig's blazer, left it with me." No response. I sat down on a concrete bench outside the terminal in the shade of an overhang, sweat already soaking through the collar of my shirt, and I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I thought about calling Margaret out of pure habit before I remembered I couldn't. That's when a voice said my name. "Walt? Walt Sorensen?" I looked up expecting a stranger. The way you do when someone says your name in a place you don't know anyone. A man in his mid-40s was walking toward me from the terminal doors, rolling a black carry-on, wearing a sport coat that fit like it cost more than my first car payment. He had the kind of face that takes a second to place, because your memory of it is 20 years younger. "It's Marcus," he said, stopping in front of me. "Marcus Whitfield. You hired me in 1998. First real job I ever had. Drafting table 3, 3rd floor, Bartlett & Cole." And there it was. Marcus Whitfield. 22 years old the last time I'd really known him. A kid with a community college associate's degree and more talent than confidence, sitting at the drafting table nearest the window because I'd put him there on purpose so the light would be good and he wouldn't have an excuse for sloppy line work. I'd spent 2 years teaching that boy everything I knew about load calculations and moment diagrams. He'd left the firm in 2004 for a job in Phoenix, and I remembered feeling proud and a little sad watching him go. The way you feel watching a kid you didn't raise walk out the door anyway. "Marcus," I said, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as relief mixed with disbelief. "My God, look at you. What are you doing sitting out here in this heat?" he said. And then he actually looked at me. Really looked. The suitcases, the garment bag that clearly wasn't mine. Whatever was showing on my face that I thought I was hiding. His expression shifted. "Walt, what's going on?" I didn't know it yet, but the next 90 minutes were going to change the entire direction of the rest of my life. I told him the short version, sitting there on that bench because I didn't have the energy to dress it up. My daughter dropped me off 4.5 hours early and drove off before I could even get my bag out properly. He listened without interrupting, the way he used to listen when I explained shear stress calculations to him at that drafting table 25 years ago. Patient, absorbing, occasionally nodding. "That's not okay, Walt," he said finally. "I don't care what's going on with her, that's not okay." "She's got a lot on her plate," I said, because apparently after 67 years, I still don't know how to stop defending my own daughter, even to a man who used to bring me coffee every morning at 7:15. Marcus didn't argue with me out loud. He just looked at me for a second in a way that told me he didn't believe a word of it. And then he said, "Come on, I've got 3 hours before my flight to Denver. There's a restaurant inside past security with real chairs and air conditioning. And you're going to sit in one and tell me what's actually going on. And then I'm going to tell you why I've been trying to track you down for 2 months. That last part stopped me cold. "Track me down?" "2 months, he said again. "Come on." We got through security together, Marcus talking to a TSA supervisor he apparently knew from some frequent flyer program to speed things along. And we sat down at a little bar and grill near gate B14 with 2 coffees and a plate of fries neither of us really wanted, but both of us needed something to do with our hands. And that's where Marcus Whitfield told me something that took the entire weekend and turned it upside down in a completely different direction than the one I was expecting. "I run a structural engineering firm now," he said. "Whitfield Structural Group, headquartered right here in Phoenix, satellite office in Denver, 91 employees. We do high-rise retrofits, seismic work, some bridge consulting. I built it from nothing, starting in 2011. "I had no idea," I said, and I meant it. And something about saying it out loud made me feel small in a way I didn't like. "Walt, I built it on your training," he said. "Every calculation method I teach my junior engineers, I learned from you at that drafting table. Every time I catch a mistake in a load path before it becomes a problem, that's your voice in my head, not some textbook. I've told that story in interviews. I've told it at conferences." He paused. 2 months ago, I got asked to speak at the National Structural Engineers Symposium in Chicago this November. And they asked me to name someone who shaped my career for a lifetime achievement recognition they do alongside it. I gave them your name. I've had a researcher trying to track down your current contact information for 2 months because Bartlett & Cole doesn't exist anymore. It got absorbed into some regional firm in 2015, and nobody had a forwarding address for you. I sat there with a lukewarm cup of coffee halfway to my mouth and didn't say anything for a long moment, because I genuinely did not know what to say to that. "You're telling me," I said slowly, "that while I was sitting on a bench outside baggage claim, wondering if my own daughter was ever going to answer her phone, you were sitting on a plane about to fly right past me, and somehow we ended up in the same terminal on the same day." "I'm telling you Margaret would have called that something," Marcus said quietly, and I realized he remembered her name. Remembered her from a company Christmas party more than 20 years ago, and something in my throat went tight enough that I had to look down at the fries for a second before I could talk again. We talked for almost 2 hours after that. He told me about the symposium, about the recognition, about wanting me there in November as his guest of honor, whether I ever said yes to anything else or not. He also told me, more carefully, that he did some occasional forensic consulting work, expert witness testimony on structural failure cases and construction litigation. And somewhere in that conversation, he asked, almost offhand, what exactly had brought me out to Scottsdale in the first place. So I told him about the folder, the quitclaim deed, the blank signature lines, the phrase, financing timing, that Craig had let slip. Marcus went quiet in a way that made me nervous. "Walt," he said carefully, "Blake Horizon Development. Is that the Cave Creek project? A community called Sonoran Vista Ranch, 40-some lots, broke ground last spring?" My stomach did something unpleasant. "That's what Craig called it, the crown jewel. How do you know that?" "Because 2 of my former clients are investors in that project," Marcus said. "And 3 weeks ago I got a call asking if my firm would do an independent structural review on some grading and drainage issues out there. Because there's a lawsuit brewing. Investors claiming misrepresentation on the engineering reports. Claiming corners got cut on soil compaction testing to save money and hit deadlines. I turned the job down because it felt like a conflict, some overlap with another client. But Walt, that lawsuit is real. It's active, and it's asking for damages north of $4 million. I sat there in that airport bar and felt something shift under my feet, the way it does when you realize a beam you trusted has a hairline crack you never caught. $4 million, financing timing, a quitclaim deed sitting ready with blank signature lines. produced on the exact weekend I happened to be visiting. Urgent enough that my flight home apparently needed to be moved up 2 hours, for no real reason at all. If you're just joining us, welcome to Sweet Family Revenge Stories. Grab a coffee, get comfortable, because this one's got a lot further to go. And if this is the kind of story that keeps you coming back, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button before we go any further, because you are going to want to see how this ends. I flew home that afternoon with Marcus's business card in my shirt pocket and a knot in my stomach that didn't loosen the entire flight. I still had Craig's blazer. I hung it in my hall closet when I got home, still on the hanger, and I looked at it for a long moment before I picked up the phone and called my oldest friend, a man named Hank Doyle. Hank and I go back to 1979, when we were both 26 years old, working our first real jobs, him in construction management, me fresh out of engineering school. He lives 2 streets over from me now, retired general contractor, wife of 41 years named Carol, who makes a pecan pie that should honestly be illegal. Hank is the kind of man who tells you the truth, even when you'd rather he didn't. And that night, sitting on my back porch with 2 beers neither of us finished, I needed exactly that. "Walt," Hank said, after I'd told him the whole thing. "The folder, the airport, Marcus, the lawsuit. You know what that document does if you sign it, don't you? Really know?" "Tell me anyway," I said. "I want to hear you say it." "It puts Craig's name on your house," Hank said. "Joint tenancy, near as I understand these things, which means if that lawsuit goes the way it sounds like it's going, and a judgment lands on Craig personally, his creditors can come after any asset with his name attached to it, including a house in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that he's never paid 1 dime of property tax on in his life. They'd have been using my house as a shield," I said slowly, the words tasting strange in my mouth, "or as collateral, or both." "Financing timing," Hank repeated back to me, shaking his head. "There's your financing timing. He needs equity to cover a legal exposure, or he needs your name and your credit to secure something before the lawsuit locks his own assets down. Either way, Walt, that folder wasn't about avoiding probate. That folder was about keeping Craig Blake's development company breathing for another 6 months, and your daughter helped put it in front of you." I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about Bailey on that patio, explaining torque ratios with a flashlight held between her teeth so she could see her own circuit board in the dark, and how nobody in that house except her had asked me a single genuine question all weekend that wasn't leading somewhere else. The next morning I called Warren Pike. His office is on Riverside Drive, 3rd floor. A view of the river if you stand at the right angle in the conference room. And he's handled my legal affairs since 1991. I drove over with the folder still in my carry-on and set it on his desk. Warren read it twice. Then he took his glasses off, set them down, and looked at me the way a man looks at you when he's about to say something he'd rather not have to. "Walt, this isn't a simple estate planning document," he said. "This is a quitclaim deed that converts sole ownership into joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. The moment you sign this, Renee and Craig become legal co-owners of that house effective immediately, not after you pass. Your retained life estate lets you keep living there, sure, but it does not protect the property from claims against either of their names. If Craig gets a judgment against him, and I understand from what you're telling me there may be one coming, a creditor absolutely can place a lien against his ownership interest in this house. So I would have handed my house to his lawsuit," I said. "You would have handed half your house to his lawsuit," Warren said. "And once Renee's name goes on that deed too, in a divorce, in a bankruptcy, in any legal proceeding involving either of them, this house stops being entirely yours to protect. I'm going to be honest with you, Walt. In 15 years of doing this, I don't see documents like this show up by accident. Somebody who knows exactly what they're doing drafted this to look simple. I sat in that conference room for a long time after Warren finished talking, looking out at the Arkansas River moving slow and brown past the window, thinking about Margaret, thinking about how many times over the years she used to say, "Renee has good instincts, Walt, let her be," and wondering when exactly those good instincts had gotten overwritten by somebody else's. I didn't call Renee that day. I didn't call her the next day either. I let 3 full days pass in silence. And I want to tell you something about silence because people ask me about this part a lot. Silence isn't nothing. Silence is a decision. Every hour I didn't call her was an hour I spent instead with Warren, with Hank, and eventually with a private accountant named Priya Nair, whom Warren recommended. Going through exactly what my financial footprint looked like inside Renee and Craig's life. Because it turned out there was more than the deed. I'd been paying Bailey's private school tuition at a place called Valley Prep Academy for 3 years. $4,000 a semester, wired directly to the school. Something I'd offered to do gladly and never once regretted. Because it was for Bailey, not for them. I'd co-signed Renee and Craig's auto loan on a Range Rover 2 years earlier when Craig's business credit wasn't strong enough to qualify a loan. A detail I'd genuinely forgotten until Priya pulled the credit report. And there it was, my name, my social security number, backing a car I'd never once ridden in. And buried in 3 years of bank statements, I found something I hadn't consciously tracked. A recurring transfer of $600 a month into an account labeled simply Renee Checking. Money I'd started sending after Margaret died because Renee had cried on the phone one night about how tight things were. And it had just quietly continued every month since, on autopilot, the way grief makes you generous without asking many questions. Nearly $9,000 a year flowing out of my accounts into theirs, on top of tuition, on top of a car loan. And at the end of that visit, the thank you I got for 30-plus years of being their financial floor was a curb, 2 suitcases, and 4 words through an open car window. I called Marcus on the 4th day, not about the deed, about the symposium in November. I told him yes, I'd come, I'd be honored. And somewhere in that conversation, I mentioned, almost in passing, everything Warren and Priya had found. Marcus went quiet again, in that same careful way. "Walt," he said, "I know a couple of the litigation attorneys representing the investors in that Cave Creek lawsuit. Not intimately, but professionally. If you want, purely as a friend, I could make an introduction, and you could understand exactly what kind of exposure Craig's actually carrying before you decide anything about that house." I said yes. What came back 10 days later through a very careful, very lawyerly phone call from a woman the investor's attorney had put me in touch with was worse than I expected. The lawsuit alleged that Blake Horizon Development had submitted falsified soil compaction reports to move the Sonoran Vista Ranch project through county permitting faster than the actual site conditions allowed, cutting costs on remediation work that should have cost close to $600,000. Cracks had already appeared in 2 completed foundations. The investors were seeking damages, and separately, the county was conducting its own review that could result in criminal referral if intentional falsification was proven. Craig wasn't just facing a civil judgment. He was facing the possibility of fraud charges. And he had needed my house, or my credit, or both, sometime in the next several weeks, to keep the whole thing propped up long enough to either settle quietly or ride out the storm. I sat with all of that for 2 more days, and then I called Renee. She answered on the second ring, which surprised me, and her voice had that same brittle brightness people use when they think they already know how a conversation is going to go, and they're bracing for it. "Dad, hey, I've been meaning to call. Things have just been crazy." "Renee," I said, and I kept my voice level. The way I used to keep it level in a boardroom, explaining to a client why a design change was going to cost them more money. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to not talk for a minute. Can you do that? There was a pause. Okay. I had Warren review the deed, I said. I know what it actually does. I know it puts Craig's name on my house, not just yours. I know about the Cave Creek lawsuit. I know about the soil compaction allegations. I know roughly what kind of exposure Craig is facing. And I know that document was drafted to move fast enough that it would have been notarized and recorded before that lawsuit ever touched anything else he owns. The silence on the other end of the line went on long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Dad, it's not what you think. I'm not finished, I said, still calm, still level. I flew 2,000 miles to see you and Bailey for a long weekend. I was dropped at curbside departures 4.5 hours before my flight with your husband's blazer and told to figure it out. That's the part I want you to sit with, Renee. Not the deed. The curb. I heard her breathing change on the other end, something catching in it. I love you, I said, and I meant every word of it. The way I'd meant it every day since she was 4 years old and fell asleep against my shoulder in a rocking chair Margaret and I bought second-hand from a church sale on Peoria Avenue. I have never once stopped loving you. But love isn't the same thing as being useful, Renee. And I think somewhere in the last few years that's the only thing I've been to you and Craig. Useful. That's not fair, she said, her voice cracking now. Then tell me it's not true, I said. Tell me the school tuition and the car loan and $600 a month I've been sending since your mother died and a quit-claim deed timed to a lawsuit you didn't think I'd find out about. Tell me none of that adds up to something. I'll believe you if you can say it and mean it. She didn't say it. She just cried, quietly, on the other end of a phone line stretching from Tulsa to Scottsdale. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let the silence sit there instead of rushing to fill it for her. Here's what's going to happen, I said finally. I'm not signing that deed. Not now. And I'm not ever going to be a financial safety net for Craig's business again. I'm ending the automatic transfer, effective this week. I'm removing myself from the Range Rover loan, which means you and Craig are going to need to refinance it in his name alone within the timeline the lender gives you, or sell it. Bailey's tuition, I want to be very clear about this, is not going anywhere. That was never for you and Craig, that was for her. And it stays exactly as it is, because that girl has never once asked me for anything except my time. You're punishing us, Renee said. And something in her voice had shifted from crying into something harder, more defensive, more like the version of her that had told me to figure it out, with the windows already rolling up. No, I said, I'm stopping. There's a difference. I spent 3 days waiting for you to call and explain yourself, before you knew I already had the answers. That tells me everything I need to know about what this weekend actually was. I hung up before she could say anything else, and I sat on my back porch for a long time in the dark, listening to the cicadas going in the trees along Marlowe Avenue. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not anger, not really, not anymore. Just a strange, quiet clarity. The kind you feel when a structural report finally confirms what you already suspected was wrong with a building, and you can finally stop pretending the crack in the foundation is just cosmetic. 2 weeks later, my attorney Warren drew up an amended will. The house on Marlowe Avenue, along with the bulk of my retirement accounts, now sits in an irrevocable trust with one named beneficiary, Bailey Renee Blake, to be administered until she turns 25, with provisions for her education fully funded, regardless of anything happening in her parents' lives. Renee is named in the will too, for what it's worth, a modest sum, a gesture rather than an inheritance, because I couldn't bring myself to cut my own daughter out entirely, no matter what she'd done. Craig's name appears nowhere in any of it. I also called Bailey directly, on her own cell phone. Something I'd honestly never done before because it always felt like going around her parents. I told her I wanted to keep doing the robotics thing, as she'd called it, whenever she wanted. Video calls, visits, whatever worked. And that nothing that happened between me and her mom and dad changed one single thing about how I felt about her. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Grandpa, Mom's been weird for like a month. I didn't know why. I'm glad you're not mad at me." I told her I could never in 100 years be mad at her, and I meant every syllable of it. That's the part of this story I need you to understand, because it's the part that actually matters more than the lawsuit or the deed or any of it. Bailey is the one who calls me now every Sunday, not because anyone tells her to, but because she wants to talk through her physics homework, or show me a new coding project, or complain about a teacher who doesn't explain torque properly. In her words, not mine. She's the loyal one in that family. She always was. I just hadn't been paying close enough attention to see it clearly until a curb in Phoenix forced me to. November came, and I flew back to Phoenix, this time on my own terms, staying at a hotel near the convention center instead of a guest room I no longer trusted. The National Structural Engineers Symposium filled a ballroom with nearly 600 people, engineers from every corner of the country. And on the second evening, Marcus Whitfield stood at a podium under stage lighting and told a room full of strangers about a drafting table by a window in downtown Tulsa in 1998. About a boss who never once let sloppy work slide. About how everything he'd built in 20 years traced back to 2 years of patient instruction from a man he was proud to call his mentor. Then he called my name, and I walked up onto that stage in front of 600 people I'd never met. And Marcus Whitfield, 44 years old, founder of a firm with 91 employees, shook my hand like I was the most important person in that entire building. Afterward, at dinner, he offered me something I hadn't expected: a standing role as senior consultant on Whitfield Structural Group's most complex projects. Part-time, my own schedule, work I could do from Tulsa most months and fly out for the rest. Not out of charity. He was very clear about that, almost stern about it, the way I used to be stern with him at that drafting table. "I need your eye on things, Walt," he said. "I've got sharp young engineers, but nobody in this firm has caught a hairline problem in a load path the way you used to catch them. I want that back in the building." I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. I still hear from Renee occasionally, a Christmas card last year, a birthday call this spring that lasted 11 minutes, and felt more honest than anything she'd said to me in the 2 years before that. Craig's lawsuit settled out of court in January, for an amount I'm told nearly wiped out the company, and Blake Horizon Development quietly dissolved sometime around March. I don't know the details of how they're managing now, and I've made my peace with not knowing, because that's not my house to keep propping up anymore. I built enough houses that stood on their own during my career to understand the difference between a foundation and a favor. Hank still comes over most Friday nights with 2 beers and Carol's pecan pie, and we sit on that same back porch and talk about nothing important, which, after everything, has come to feel like the most important thing there is. Marcus and I talk most weeks now, about steel connections and seismic retrofits, and sometimes about nothing work-related at all. And every Sunday evening at 7, my phone rings, and it's Bailey, usually somewhere between a math problem and a story about her robotics team. And I sit in my kitchen on Marlowe Avenue and I listen to every single word of it. Because I finally understand something it took 67 years and one very hot curb in Phoenix to teach me. Love that only shows up when it needs something from you was never love in the first place. It was a transaction wearing love's clothing. And I wore those clothes for a long time without noticing the fit was wrong. But the people who show up for no reason at all, who explain gear ratios to you by flashlight, who call because they want to, not because they need something signed, those are the ones you build your foundation around. Those are the ones worth every beam. I think about that afternoon at Sky Harbor sometimes, standing there holding a stranger's blazer, sweating through my shirt, genuinely believing for about 40 minutes that I had been left with nothing at all. I hadn't been left with nothing. I'd been left standing exactly where I needed to be standing, at exactly the right moment, for someone who actually remembered my name to walk straight toward me and remind me what it felt like to matter to somebody for the right reasons. Sometimes the worst moment of your life is just the universe clearing a curb so somebody better can pull up to it. If you made it this far with me, thank you, genuinely. If this story meant something to you, do me a favor and hit that like button, drop a comment, and tell me where you're listening from, and subscribe if you haven't already, because we've got a lot more stories like this one coming. I'll see you on the next.